Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi, the Daf Yomi for Shabbos is Kesubos Daf Chaf Dalad Chaf Kesubos 24. We're going to start on the bottom of Chaf Gimel Amud Beis and 23b at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "V'chein shnei anashim." Let's say you have two men. Zel mer Kohen ani. This one says, "I was a Kohen." Hold on. If you have two men, this one says I was a Kohen, or in the bottom of 23b, and Zel mer Kohen ani, and this one says I'm a Kohen. Ein ne'amanim. We're not going to believe them to allow them to give them truma, to allow them to eat the truma. We're not going to believe them on that basis. Ubizman shehema eden zetzeh, but when they are testifying about each other, they're saying that each one says, both me and my friend are a Kohen, meaning they're testifying about each other. Then we're going to say, Harei Elu Ne'emanim. Under those circumstances, we're going to believe them. Under those circumstances, we're going to say under those circumstances that we believe them. So, meaning one person is enough to establish the other person as a Kohen. Rabbi Yehuda says that we are not going to allow one person to allow the other person to be established as a Kohen. You can't do it on the basis of one Kohen. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amasai, when do we say one person is not enough to allow the other person to be elevated to the status of a Kohen? The Malcolm Sheyesh Orin, in a circumstance where there are people who are objecting to the fact that they're a Kohen. However, Malcolm Shein Orim, but if there's nobody objecting, then we're going to allow them to become Kohanim on the basis of one witness. Rashbag says, Rashbag says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, the son of the Skan, indeed we do elevate people to the Kuna on the basis of one witness. And the Gemara is going to discuss what's the difference between Rashbag's position and Rabbi Elazar's position. So first of all, the Gemara is going to say we've been discussing a series of cases that we called Pesha Asar, who are Pesha Hitir. The mouth that prohibits is the one that allows. Going back to the beginning of the chapter, we've been discussing these cases. So the Gemara says, why do we need all these cases? Called Hani Lamali. Why do we need all these cases where we say we give because this person is the one who said the prohibition, therefore we believe them when they say that it's permitted. Why do we need so many different Mishnayos to all establish the same principle? So the Gemara explains on the bottom of 23b, Tzricha, we need all of these cases. Why? The Itana Modeh Rabbi Yoshua, if we just had the case of where Rabbi Yoshua was Modeh, remember the case where Rabbi Gamliel was arguing with Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yoshua was Modeh. Under those circumstances, where Rabbi Yoshua says that he's modeh, if the person says this this field was your father's, but I bought it from him. If we just had that case, mishum deika derar de mona, because that case he was costing himself money. He says this was your father's field, so it's clearly he was intending to say the second part, which was, but I bought it from him. Avol edim, but in this circumstance where the witnesses say this was our signature, but we were psulim, but we were disqualified. There, we might have thought the lake of Derora to Mamona. The witnesses are not costing themselves money. I might have thought Imalo. Maybe we don't say Pesha Asar or Pesha Hita there. Vitana Adim, and if we just had the case of the witnesses, Mishum de la Alma, because they're not testifying about themselves. It doesn't help him at all. Maybe that's why we believe it. But meaning to say, because of other people, he's not going to recant. But he himself, since it relates to him, maybe he's changing his story to benefit himself. Amaro. And we're on the top of 24a. And if we only had these two cases, I might have said Mishum de Memona, because both of those cases relate to monetary issues. Remember the case of the woman who says, I was a married woman, but I was divorced. The Isura, or that's a case where it's not a monetary case. That's a matter of case of whether she's permitted to be with her husband or not. So I might have said we don't allow Pasha Asar or Pasha Heter in that case. And nishbeiti tahora ani lamali. Why do we also then need this second case there, which says I was captured, but I wasn't assaulted? Why does the Mishnah need to teach us that case? Mishum de kabayla misnei, because we want to teach the next case, which says v'imi shenises bo edim harezu lo teitzi, because we want to teach the last case of that Mishnah, which says if once she got married on that basis, the witnesses came, then she doesn't have to leave the marriage because the witnesses came after she already got married. But remember, we had this discussion. The discussion was in the Gemara. Does that statement imishani says? Well, say we had this discussion on Chof Gimel Amud Aleph. On which part of the Mishnah does that apply to? Because there are two parts of that Mishnah. One part of that Mishnah, the Reisha says, it refers to a case. The Reisha is a case which says I was married, but I was divorced. And the Seifa is a case which it states that I was captured, but I was not assaulted. So if you say this statement, once she gets married, she does. If the witnesses came when she gets married, she doesn't have to leave. We had a discussion. It makes sense to say we need to teach a second teaching because it applies to the last part. She says I was captured, but I was not assaulted. That's why we need to have this case. But the one who says that this case that says if the witnesses came after she was married, she doesn't leave, that applies to the case where she says I was married, but then I was divorced. Well, if that's the case, why do we have to have the case where she says I was captured, but I was not assaulted? Gemara says, Mishum Kabayla Misnei, because we want to teach the next case of Shtei Nashim, the next case of two women, Shenishbu, the two women that are captured. We want to teach this case of the two women that are captured, that to tell us that when they testify against each other, they are going to be believed. So since we want to teach this case of the two women who are captured, that when they testify against each other, they're believed. So therefore, we taught this case as well. So the Gemara says, why do we need to teach this case of the two women that are captured, that when they testify about each other, that they are believed? Why do we need to teach that case? The Gemara says, because you might have thought that we were not going to believe them because of the concern of Goman. What's Goman? Goman is we don't believe that your testimony because we think that there's some subterfuge going on, that you're testifying to her benefit because later on she's going to testify to your benefit. Kamashmalan, so we don't say that. So why do we need the case of the two men that we're saying here? The two men, one's a Kohen. Testifying about the other one? Why do we need that case? This is the last case. This is our Mishnah that we start today's daf. Because we want to teach the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. That Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't elevate somebody to the kuna on the basis of one witness, and the Rabbanan said you do. And so therefore, since they want to teach that case, therefore they brought in that case as well. And that's why the Gemara is now explained why we have all these cases of a pasha asr or pasha iter. So the Gemara says Tana Rabbanan. We have a brayso that says if a person says Ani Kohen, Chaveri Kohen. So if a person comes along and says, I'm a Kohen, and my chaver is a Kohen, then my friend is a Kohen, then we're going to believe him to feed his friend Truma, meaning to say that we are going to allow his friend to eat the Truma. And we're not going to believe him to allow him to marry a woman. And in this case, what do you mean? You don't need to be a Kohen to marry a woman, but we're saying that in order to marry a woman on the basis of the kahuna, to say that they're on that level of that they're the highest level of yichus. So if a person comes home and says, "I'm a Kohen, my friend's a Kohen," so we're going to trust him to that his friend can eat the truma, but it's not trustworthy enough to allow the marriage, because when it comes to lineage, we have a higher degree of responsibility. Achu Gimel, you need three people. Shnayim you need each one as two witnesses testifying for lineage to allow the marriage. You need two people testifying about each one. Two about this one, Shnayim idim alzeh, and Shnayim idim alzeh. So you need two different people testifying about each one. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Eino Neman Lachil B'Truma. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbanan. He says we're not even going to allow him to eat from the truma. Yes.
What are they worried about the marriage? That he's gonna marry a grusha?
No, they're worrying about the status of the marriage, that there's a higher level of concern. So it's a very good question. There's a lot of discussion amongst the Rishonim. What's really the discussion here with respect to the marriage? What's the level? Is it just a person who's in general just wants to be concerned that the person is completely pure yichus and they want to marry a kohen, or maybe the person is a cholal. You want to make sure the person is not as a chol, and then if you marry them, if you're a woman, you're going to become disqualified. There is a very extensive discussion amongst Rishonim what exactly is the concern. So one of the questions is the chol.
Are they more concerned about the kids?
Well, if the person is then the child will be a chol as well. Some say that we want to make. Some say the concern is that they're a mamzer. We want to make sure that that you're saying that they're not a mamzer, because if they're a kohen, they're for sure not a mamzer. So that's what they're also saying.
But if you eat truma and you're not a kohen,
that's the question.
Right?
We're going to believe that we're going to believe them to allow them to eat truma, but not to allow them to not to believe them.
But the avera is if you eat truma and you're
right. So the Gemara is going to ask that question. One is a non-kohen eats truma is punishable by death. The Gemara and it seems to be a worse penalty. So the Gemara is going to get into that. Okay. So the Gemara says as follows. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, "Af eino neman lachil b'truma." We're not going to believe them even to eat truma. Shnai midin al zeh, shnai midin al zeh. So Rabbi Yehuda says we're not going to believe them to eat truma on the basis of one witness. You need three people, so you have two witnesses testifying at each one. So in this case, Rabbi Yehuda says we don't believe them. Does this mean Rabbi Yehuda chayesh legomen? Why does Rabbi Yehuda not believe them if there's just one testifying about each one? Because Rabbi Yehuda is concerned that maybe they're doing a subterfuge and they're lying to benefit the other one. The Rabbanan in this case, lo chayesh legomen. The Rabbanan are not concerned and they believe him. Mar says but didn't we learn the opposite? The Tanakh we learned in the Mishnah. We learned in the Mishnah in Demai that it says Achamar. Let's say you have donkey drivers. They come into the city. And one of the donkey drivers says, "Listen, Shali Chadash, Yashan." He says, "Listen, my crops, my grain that I'm selling. Listen, it's new, but my friend's is old. Old is better than new. Nowadays we want new, but when it comes to grain." Rashi says he's mishabeach as chaveru mizalzel et shalo. He's praising his friend's crops and saying they're better than me, and so because the older grain is firmer, and then he says, "Shali eino mitukan." My crops are not tithed. V'shal chaveru mitukan, but my friend's crops they're already tithed. Eino neman. We're not going to believe him because we're going to assume that since he's an Ama Aretz, he's not going to be believed about the Meiser, even though he's testifying that his own are not matukun, and he's praising his friends. He's not believed because here we're concerned about that they're doing this subterfuge. They're doing ma'arimin, so that they're tricking it. So, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says neman, Rabbi Yehuda believes him. So we see from here that they reverse the positions. That the Chachamim are concerned about Gomer, and Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned about the subterfuge. So the first answer to this contradiction is Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Bar Amar Rav Uchafas Hashita. The two positions are reversed, and therefore one of them is the opposite, and they're both the opposite, and we have to match up the positions. The Gemara doesn't say which one is which, but we know that the sugyos are sugyo muchafot, and one of them has to be switched. Abai says, no, you don't have to say that there's a way to dovetail the two sugyas. You don't have to say that they're opposites, that there's a reason why Rabbi Yehuda in this case it says we believe him, and in the other case where the Kohen is testifying about the other Kohen that we don't believe him. What's the reason? Because he says, because he says since it's about a question about the Mai, therefore, the Mai is a case we're not sure if they actually tithed. So therefore, the rabbis were lenient because most of the people took Meiser. And so therefore, we're going to believe him if he testifies to the case and he says they took Meiser. Rabbi Yehuda says we could be lenient and believe him. So that's why Rabbi Yehuda, in this case, by the case of the Mai, he says we could be lenient. Whereas in the case of the Kohen, Rabbi Yehuda is not lenient. So Rava says to Rav Bar Abba, Rava says to Abaye, Rava says to Rabbi Yehuda, Kasha, fine, you've solved the problem with Rabbi Yehuda, but what about the Rabbanan? Well, Kasha, the Rabbanan are also the opposite position. Now the Rabbi Yehuda, so Rava gives a different answer. He says, Rabbi Yehuda, well, Kasha, Kiddushanina. Like I accept your answer about Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda. But the Rabbanan lo kasha. Why? Rabbi Chama bar Ukva. Because why do the Rabbanan say in this case we're not believing him? Because he says in the case of the donkey drivers, we're not going to believe him because the shekli umnasa biyado comes in. The donkey driver comes in with his, like we saw in a different case where Rabbi Chama bar Ukva said that he contextualized a different case by saying that the person has his utensil to sell. And so here too, that's what's going on here on top of 24b. That the donkey driver brings in his crops to sell, and he was bringing in his hand a utensil to sell it. Like for example, Rashi says like the level that they used to measure things with, and so therefore, since he has this utensil in it, and he's denigrating his own crops. We know, Rashi says, Anan Sahadi, that it looks like he brought in to sell it. So therefore, the reason why he's praising the other person is because it says, in this town, I'll praise yours. And when it comes to the next town, you'll praise mine. So that's why we say, that's why the Rabbanim don't believe him, because we look from the context that this guy looks like he's lying. So the Gemara says, well, Vehecha Itmar the Rabbi Chama bar Ukva. So where else did Rabbi Chama bar Ukva teach this law, where it says, Keshaklium naso biyado, and we don't believe him because it looks like he's lying because he's got his utensils, his tools, that looks like he's selling. We learned in the following case. In the following case, in the Mishnah, Hakadar, this was the Mishnah in Taharos. Let's say you have a potter, if he put his pots down, and he went down to drink the water from the river, Hapnimios Taharos, the inner pots are going to be richly pure, Vachitonios Tameos, and the outer pots are Tamei. We're going to explain why. But we have a contradictory source that says that both pots are tamei. Both pots are tamei, even the inner ones. So Amar Mechamer bar Ukva v'shakli umnaso biyado. So what are we talking about? Where he brought the pots in, and it's clear that he's selling them, and so therefore mesha yara kol mesha pahan. But because everybody is touching them, and so therefore to check them to whether or not to see their tahor or tamei. And therefore, we're going to say that they're tamei. But didn't we say that both pots are tahor? So Amarav Chama bar Ukva. So Rav Chama bar Ukva says, when are both pots tahor? The other way. He didn't bring them in to sell them, so he's watching them to make sure nobody touches them, and so therefore they're tahor. How do we explain the Mishnah which says Apnimios tahoros v'achitzonios tameos? How do we explain the Mishnah that says the inner pots are tahor and the outer pots are tamei? How do we explain that? So how do we explain that? We explain that as follows. How do we explain it? We explain it this the smicha rishus harabim, because that he put the pots down on the road next to the public domain, and people in the public domain are rubbing against them. So therefore, the pots that he brought in to sell, everybody's going to touch them, and those are tamei. The pots that he's not selling, they're tahor. And what are the pots that we say the outer ones are tamei? Those are the ones that are closest to the public domain, and the inner ones are not near the public domain, and so therefore they're tahor. The bias amar, alternatively, how else can we explain this contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan? We say in this case, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, that Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan are arguing about whether or not we can elevate a person from truma to yochsin. Because we have evidence that they're eating truma, we're going to also allow them to be elevated to the status of a Kohen with respect to marriage. Rabbi Yehuda Sava, Rabbi Yehuda Rashi says, Dr. Rashi explains this. Rabbi Yehuda's in the position, if somebody sees that you're eating truma, then we're going to assume that that's enough, that he's a Kohen, and therefore you can elevate him to the kahuna. And so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that if somebody sees somebody eating truma as a Kohen, then he's going to always testify that he's a Kohen, and he's going to elevate him with respect to marriage. And so therefore, if you're going to feed him truma, you're going to cause him to marry somebody. And so therefore, the reason why, therefore, it has nothing to do with Gomen. but it's just that Rabbi Yehuda says that if you feed him the truma, you're also going to cause him to, people are going to get married. And the Rabbanon of the position, no, we don't say, Ein ma'al mitruma yosin. We're not going to say that just because we see him eating the truma, we're going to allow him to get married. And so therefore, going back to this Gemara, where the Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow him to eat the truma, is because he says if you feed him the truma, then he's going to come and get married on that basis, assuming that he's a Kohen. So now the Gemara asked the question, Gemara asked the question, are we able to elevate a person on the basis of the contract? The contract says that they're a Kohen. En passant, the contract says they're a Kohen. Are we able to say on that basis, yeah, he's a Kohen, and now we can marry, and we can marry this person as a Kohen? Really, with respect to marriage, we're going to view this person as a Kohen. Where says, wait 1 second, what's this question? What's the scenario? What about if the contract says, Ani Ploni Kohen, I so and so the Kohen, Chasamti 8, I signed as a witness. Well, man kamasid alai. Well, in that case, who's testifying? He's just himself saying he's a Kohen. That's not sufficient. No, Gemara says, no, it's true. No, we're talking about a certain scenario. The Ksivbe, Ani Ploni Kohen, I the Ploni the Kohen, Livisi Mana mi Ploni. I borrowed money from so and so. I Mr. Cohen, I borrowed money from so and so. V'chasimu sahadi, and the witnesses sign on the bottom of that document. So the Gemara says, so since the witnesses are signing on the bottom of the document, when the witnesses sign, what do they sign on? Amana shebashtar kamasadi? Do they sign on the money? When the witnesses sign that contract, are they testifying to the money in the contract? Or maybe the witnesses are testifying to everything in the contract, which is that this person is also a Kohen. So that's the question. So are we going to elevate a person from the contract to lineage on the basis of something that's in a contract, which is it's in contract in passing, which the witness is signed? So Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, Chad Amar Ma'al, and Chad Amar Imal. And so Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, one says we would elevate them, and one says we wouldn't. The Gemara says, what about if a person does the Birkas Kohanim? Can we say on that basis that they're really a Kohen and we can marry them as though they are a Kohen? And so this is going to be a question according to the one. Remember, we said Rabbi Yehuda says if you see the person eating truma, you're going to establish them as a Kohen, and it's a question according to the one who says we wouldn't do that. And according to one who says we would elevate them, truma. Maybe in the case of truma, we elevate them. As my father pointed out before, to avamisa, truma is so significant; it's a punishment of death, and so therefore we see them eating truma. For sure, we're going to say that we can marry them as a Kohen. If a non-Kohen eats a truma, it's a punishment of death, and so therefore, if we see somebody eating truma, we say for sure that they're a Kohen. On the Siyos Kapayim, the Birkas Kohanim, if a non-Kohen gives the Birkas Kohanim, that's what's called an Isur Aseh. It's a Lav Abamikal Aseh. It's just a prohibition that comes from the Kohen is supposed to do it. And so therefore, if you're not a Kohen, it's what's called a Lav Abamikal Aseh, as Rashi says. So that's much less severe penalty. So maybe we wouldn't elevate them on that basis. So it's a question according to that approach. But Dilma, or maybe Loshna, or maybe there's no difference. And then the Gemara says Tibayel Mandamar. It's also a question according to the one that says Ein Mal, and that we would not elevate a person from Truma to lineage. Hani Mila Truma. Maybe Truma we wouldn't elevate you to say you're for sure going with respect to marriage. Because Truma, if we see you eating Truma, it's not necessarily an indication because you eat the Truma in private. So it's not an indication that the whole world knows you're a Kohen. When the Siyos Kapayim, but when it comes to the Birkas Kohanim, the Befarhesia, that's a public situation. Ilav Kohen, if he's not a Kohen, Kuli Ai Lo Machat Finish Nafshe. A person's not going to be so arrogant to get up in front of the whole shul and start giving the Birkas Kohanim. Or maybe no, there's no distinction between them. That just like you don't elevate the person from Truma, you don't elevate them from Birkas Kohanim. Rav Chisda, Rabbi Avinai, Chadam or Malan, Chadam or Imal. One says you would elevate them. One says you don't elevate them. Armai Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak or Rava. So now Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak turns to Rava and he says, can we elevate a person from the Birkas Kohanim to say that they're a Kohen with respect to marriage? He says, Armai Pulta to Rav Chisda and Rav Avinai. Yeah, this is the dispute between Rav Chisda and Rav Avinai. He says, what's the halacha? He says, Amoy Masnisa Yadan. He says, I know a brisa. What does the brisa say? Tanya Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, it says, and it's the brisa that also appears in Kedushin. He says, Gedolah Chazak. He says, I'm going to tell you how great is the presumptive status. Chazaka is so great. Shenamar, it says in the book of Ezra, it says in Ezra chapter 2, and that the sons of the Kohanim who came up, they were Bnei Chaviyah, Bnei Akotz, Bnei Barzilai, Asher Lakach Mibnot Barzilai Giladi. They took from they married the daughters of Barzilai the Giladi, Ishav, the Karei al Shemam, and they were called for their names. Ela Bikshu Ksavam, so they wanted to prove that they were Kohanim, and they Bikshu Ksavam Hamet Yachsim. They wanted to prove that they were Kohanim. They traced their lineage. They wanted to get their genealogy. And so therefore they couldn't find it. And they kicked him out of the Kuna. Vayomer Hatir Shasa, and that's a reference. Hatir Shasa is a reference to Nehemiah. Vayomer Hatir Shasa lahem asher lo yachlu mikodesh hakodashim. That he said that you cannot eat from the Holy of Holies food, which is presumably a reference to Kodshim. Ad Amod Kohen Urim V'Tumim, until the Kohen will stand in front of the Urim V'Tumim and ask, which basically means until the Messiah comes, you can't eat from the most sacred food. But Rashi says, doesn't this mean specifically from the Kodesh HaMikdash that you're disqualified, but from the Truma that you used to eat in the Gola outside outside the land of Israel, you weren't prohibited because that you were already established. Meaning we allow you to continue eating the Truma, but we're not going to allow you to eat from the sacred food of the temple because you don't have a chazaka for that. So
Rabbi, but I asked this. Yes. I think we talked about this before, but at some point there was no truma.
But at this point, they still had it. Obviously, they still had the truma. This is the beginning of the second temple, and they still had the truma here. So the Gemara says. And that the Kodshei Gvul is a reference to Truma, which had the practice to eat even outside of the temple and Jerusalem. So too also here, Avkam B'Kodshei Gvul. And if you're going to be in the position, so and if you're going to say, well, we should elevate people from the Birkat Kohanim all the way to marriage, Hani Kivan the Parsi Adayu. Well, since these people are blessing their hands, they're giving the Birkat Kohanim. I'll see last skin. Why aren't we concerned that we're going to elevate them to the Kuna on that basis? Mar says no. Shani Hacha. This case is different. Excuse me. He says this case is different, and what is the reason why? Excuse me. He says, excuse me. This case is different. The real Chazkayu. What's the reason why this case was different? Excuse me. Because everybody knew that there was a problem with their Chazaka. Since other people were being seen eating the Kodshei Kodashim and they weren't, so the fact that they were giving the Birkas Kohanim is not enough to elevate them to Yichus. So we can't give a proof from this answer. All right, we'll pick this up, God willing,